with every generation that has passed us by.
Long live the cause of freedom.
And every event that has shaped who we are, comes the awareness that history lives in all of us. Pick a time, choose a place, and escape to where the past comes alive.
Mine eyes have seen the glory.
The History Channel.
The story of wealth in America spans the centuries. Across time, the rich have had the power to fascinate. Their privileges, their pastimes have always made for compelling, high-stakes drama. In every generation, the question has been asked, are the rich different from you and me?
Well, I think the rich are different, as F. Scott Fitzgerald said, only for one reason: they just have more money.
The rich are different. They have peace of mind, for one thing. They don't have to worry where their next meal is coming from or whether they can send the baby to the dentist. It's quite different from the average person who's really scrambling to stay afloat.
Whether they're a breed apart or just like the average Joe, some people do have more money, a lot more money than the rest of us. And perhaps that's the reason we're endlessly fascinated. And it's been that way from the beginning.
From the time man was in a cave, there was always some preeminent person, the leader of the clan, the one who killed more bears or dragged more women off by the hair or something. And everybody looked up to them, and it has not changed one bit. There are VIPs and the rest of us.
Our VIPs are under constant scrutiny.
Wealth and recognition are very important because they are the symbols of having made it, having made one's mark in this world. There has always been an unusual amount of fascination with people who have made it, about how they live their lives.
We wonder what it means to have all that money. Can money buy freedom or happiness? One thing is clear: money means power. And with this wealth and power comes responsibility.
I think great wealth is a great test of character. Great wealth gives you more choices than most people have in life, and you can use those choices well, or you can use them badly. And you can do great good, or you can do great evil to yourself, as well as to society.
The rich have always been on center stage, enacting a drama with real consequences for themselves and for the rest of us. And by the time Town and Country magazine began publishing in 1846, that drama, the story of the rich in America, was already well underway. In the 1800s, America was all about the frontier. For the common man, the American dream shimmered somewhere far off in the rough and tumble West. Settlers could strike it rich in the gold mines of California or in Texas, where lands violently wrested from Mexicans and Native Americans were theirs for the taking. But back east, life went on serenely, as it always had for the reigning elite. In the years before the Civil War, America's affluent had already been in place for generations. It was a small circle who could trace their ancestry back to the first great merchant families of the 1700s, or even further, to the recipients of vast land grants made by European kings in the 1600s. In the southern states, the upper class lived like European landed gentry on vast plantation estates. Slaves took the place of the peasantry and created great fortunes with their labor. The southern elite emulated the leisurely life of the British aristocrat.
Everything that they could think of that was aristocratic and European was top drawer. They modeled their lives on European lives because those were the only models they had.
In the North, wealth stemmed from shipping and international trade and was increasingly concentrated in cities like Philadelphia and Boston. In each place, the rich old families organized themselves into tight cliques that came to be known as society, spelled with a capital S. But there was one city alone that emerged as the radiant center of American society: New York. New York society was made up of a handful of old Dutch, French, and English families who'd been prominent since the 1600s. The old families with names like Van Rensselaer, Stuyvesant, and Roosevelt came to be known as the Knickerbockeracy, and they were as insular as the island on which they lived.
The word society really meant the moneyed classes. It was a club of sorts, like any society with a capital S is a club, built upon friendship, familiarity, family, people who had common interests, like backgrounds.
Mrs. John King Van Rensselaer was descended from one of New York's oldest and richest Dutch families. In her memoirs, she recalled the world of her childhood.
Society grew from within rather than from without in the early days. The foreign elements absorbed were negligible. We were exclusive folk, proud of our lineage. Between us and the rest of the world was a boundary as solid and difficult to ignore as the Chinese Wall. Mrs. John King Van Rensselaer.
Society was very staid. It was focused very much on family, very strong traditional values, not ostentatious in any way. In fact, what people don't know about society at that time is that many people in society didn't have any money anymore.
There were, however, people outside of society who had plenty of money. Most notably, John Jacob Astor, the founding father of one of America's longest-lasting dynasties. The son of a butcher, Astor had come to America from Germany in 1783 at age 20. Astor quickly established a thriving business trading with the Indians for furs on the frontier. By 1800, he'd built a modest fortune by exporting furs to China and importing tea and silk on the return voyages.
When old New York money saw the new people coming in, they reacted to them the way old money always reacts to new money. That is, they thought they were vulgar, they thought they were loud, they thought they were rude, and in many cases they were absolutely right.
New York society did not welcome John Jacob Astor with open arms. They said he was no gentleman. He could barely read or write. He ate peas and ice cream with a knife. Once he shocked his hostess by wiping his fingers on her sleeve. Astor took little notice of society, for his focus was on making money, and he had a natural talent for it. He began amassing real estate. His first purchase for $25,000 was a farm that spread from what is now Times Square west to the Hudson River. As New York grew, Astor bought up most of the Lower East Side and other large parcels all over the city, earning him the nickname New York's landlord. His purchases were made at a time when Manhattan land values were skyrocketing. When he died, Astor was by far the richest man in the Americas. He left his son, William Backhouse Astor, undeveloped real estate worth $20 million. With waves of immigrants flooding into lower Manhattan tenements, John Jacobs' descendants would become the first big slum landlords. When confronted with the degrading conditions their tenants lived in, the Astors could always counter that they owned the land, not the buildings. William Backhouse Astor doubled the fortune left him by his father. Other men, such as steamship magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt, were building substantial fortunes of their own. But prosperity was threatened by simmering hostilities between the North and the South. In 1861, the conflict erupted into a war that would tear America apart. How wealthy Americans faced the challenge of the Civil War boiled down to a matter of personal character. Banker J.P. Morgan, like many wealthy men of the day, paid another man $300 to fight in his place. Yet other wealthy men on both sides of the conflict gave their lives on the battlefields of Gettysburg and Antietam. Commodore Vanderbilt's favorite child, his youngest son, died in service in the war. Society women also had personal choices to make during the Civil War. In the winter of 1865-66, about 600 balls were held in New York City alone. Although many of the balls were fundraisers for the war effort, some society women chose to make a more direct contribution. In New York, wealthy women formed a nurses' organization called the U.S. Sanitary Commission.
One of the very first times that society women left their home, some of them even went to the field with the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was regarded as absolutely extraordinary. Ladies did not do that. The care of the wounded and the sick during the Civil War was a scandal. And the U.S. Sanitary Commission and the women who worked for it saved the lives of thousands of soldiers.
In 1865, the war mercifully came to an end. Hundreds of thousands of Americans had lost their lives in the bloody conflict. The South lay in ruins, entering a period of decline that lasted deep into the 20th century. But in the North, it was a new day, the dawn of the industrial age. Vast fortunes, greater than the world had ever seen, were about to be made. While the South lay in ruins, a new world emerged in the North. An industrial world, forged by great entrepreneurs, gave rise to unimaginable riches. Factories which had sprung up like mushrooms to aid the war effort were converted to commercial use. And thanks to wartime transportation needs, railroads had grown to include thousands of miles of new track. On May 10, 1869, railroads from the east and west were linked at Promontory Point, Utah. For the first time, the United States was truly united into one huge market stretching from sea to shining sea. And with few government regulations in place, the time was ripe for entrepreneurs to make millions and freely crush their competition.
There were steamships, there were railroads, there were oil fields. Anytime you're a pioneer in a new field of business, you're the one who's going to make money. The richest men will always be the men with the talent and the foresight to see where the opportunities are. Usually, that doesn't make them gentlemen.
John D. Rockefeller rolled over smaller competitors on his way to creating the Standard Oil monopoly. The word billionaire would be coined to describe him. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, was a farm boy from Staten Island. He increased the fortune he had made in steamships when he united the Eastern Railways into a formidable monopoly with New York at its heart. J.P. Morgan built a banking business so powerful that the U.S. Treasury would turn to him to stave off its own bankruptcy. Andrew Carnegie, a dirt-poor Scotch immigrant, saw a big future in the iron ore coming out of the ground around Pittsburgh. He came to dominate the fledgling steel industry. Called by some the captains of industry and by others the robber barons, these men, through the force of their will, created the industrial economy of this country. There was, of course, a price to pay. Men like Carnegie depended on company towns, child labor, starvation wages, and no safety precautions to wring the last dollar of profit out of their organizations. In 1892, the workers at Carnegie's Homestead mine went out on strike. In one of labor history's most infamous moments, armed Pinkerton agents were sent against the strikers. Many were killed in the ensuing melee. It was an event that would haunt Carnegie for the rest of his life.
The question is asked, isn't money tainted? And it's asked especially about the robber barons, that Carnegie was a very generous man, he built all these libraries, but he crushed the working class at Homestead during the strikes. And therefore, doesn't this somehow undercut or subvert the virtue of their philanthropic acts? This line of argument is very naive. Any European would point out that their upper classes got their start with the sword, raping, pillaging, laying waste to the countryside.
Regardless of their methods, the moguls made money like it was going out of style. At a time when the average American made $1,000 a year, Rockefeller's fortune would grow to $900 million, and Carnegie's to $500 million. Upon his death, the Commodore left his son, William Henry Vanderbilt, a fortune worth $90 million, or in today's money, more than $1 billion. As with John Jacob Astor before them, the emerging moguls were snubbed by old money New York society. The Knickerbockeracy pulled up the drawbridges and looked down on the newly rich with disdain.
What's amusing about this whole new rich, old rich relationship is that it always started with the new rich. The new rich will always at some point, some subtle moment, become members of the establishment.
How quickly a self-made man might ascend to the heights of society was often dependent on whom he married.
Men of no social distinction have frequently become prominent in society by marrying women of breeding. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, and other present leaders have attained their station through the infusion of aristocratic blood into their line through marriages with the old families. Their wives made them. Mrs. John King von Rensselaer.
For the Astors, one of America's wealthiest families, it took 3 generations of marrying upward to reach society's pinnacle. William Backhouse Astor II, the grandson of John Jacob the fur trader, broke in by marrying Carolyn Schimmerhorn, daughter of an old, respected New York family. Carolyn's ambitions were as deep as her pockets, and her considerable energies were almost wholly dedicated to advancing her family socially. Through the sheer force of her personality, Carolyn became New York's social dictator. A rather plump and plain woman, she wore so many diamonds that she was once described as a walking chandelier. Long before her husband died, she dropped his name from her title and was known thereafter simply as Mrs. Astor, the Mrs. Astor. She was besieged by women campaigning to be invited to one of her luncheons, balls, or soirees. To attend an Astor affair meant that you dwelt at the highest level of society. Her lieutenant was Ward McAllister, a self-styled connoisseur of manners and taste, whose pronouncements were gospel to the socially insecure. Together, Mrs. Astor and McAllister would devise one of history's greatest acts of snobbery, the List of the 400. 400 people who were acceptable company at a ball because they possessed the all-important 3 B's: birth, breeding, and background.
We all learn on the school playground about a little drama of you're in, you're out. You're one of the guys, you're not one of the guys. The drama of inclusion and exclusion. And you can't have one without the other. The public loved this drama. They read about it in the newspapers, who was invited to such and such a ball by Mrs. Astor, and who was left off the list. This was front page stuff.
Although they were present at Mrs. Astor's famous Ball of the 400 in 1892, only 9 years earlier, the fabulously wealthy Vanderbilts had been conspicuously absent from Mrs. Astor's guest lists. The tobacco-chewing, salty-tongued Commodore and his son after him had never been welcomed by the establishment. The old guard whispered that Vanderbilt money was so new you could hear the crisp bills crackling as they walked down the street. As a result, William K. Vanderbilt, the Commodore's grandson, and his new wife, Alva, found themselves on the outside looking in. But all that was to change in 1883, when Alva decided to confront Mrs. Astor head-on. To celebrate the completion of her new Fifth Avenue mansion, she would invite 1,200 friends to a sumptuous costume ball. All New York had watched the magnificent palace rise up, and curiosity about its interior was intense. It was the hottest ticket in town.
The Vanderbilt Ball has agitated New York society more than any social event that has occurred here in many years. Since the announcement that it would take place, scarcely anything else has been talked about. It has disturbed the sleep and occupied the waking hours of social butterflies, both male and female. The New York Times, March 27, 1883.
If you didn't get invited to that ball, you wanted to commit suicide. You certainly left town. You went to Europe, saying, "Oh, I couldn't possibly be there. How sad."
As part of Alva's ball, there was to be a dance competition. Hearing this, Carolyn Astor's 2 eldest daughters devised a quadrille for the occasion and practiced it devotedly. The girls were crushed when their mother told them that they would not be attending. When asked why Mrs. Astor had not been invited, Alva Vanderbilt replied simply that she had never had the pleasure of meeting Mrs. Astor.
Mrs. Astor, who was a tall lady of very few words and of very few personal attractions, was immensely jealous of Mrs. Vanderbilt, who was petite and very attractive and extremely vivacious and always had something to say. Mrs. Astor swallowed her pride as a good mother so her daughters could go to this great party, called on Mrs. Vanderbilt and left her car.
A matter of hours later, Mrs. Astor received her invitations. And legend has it, at that moment, Mrs. Vanderbilt formally entered society.
When Mrs. Astor left the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, Alva Vanderbilt must have clasped her hands above her head and said, "I've made it. I've done it. I'm in."
At the turn of the century, successful social climbers would soon discover they were in a strange and foreign land. A land where the rich sent their children away to boarding schools and gave their dogs $15,000 collars. A place where the wealthy attended balls dressed up as lords and ladies and married their heartbroken daughters off to real noble suitors. In the 1880s, the newly rich discovered that making money was easy compared to breaking into society. Old money culture still held sway. To gain acceptance in society, one had to master and adhere to a bewildering set of rigidly defined rules.
The rich, especially the children of the rich, had been brought up in such different circumstances that they were substantially different from the middle class. Over the course of time, there was developed a kind of curriculum, a life curriculum for the children of the rich.
For those born rich, the growing numbers who didn't need to make it on their own, the curriculum began in the cradle. First, they were to be isolated from the potentially corrupting influence of their parents, fathers who, it was feared, were too strong, and mothers who might be too soft. Children were placed in the care of strict nannies and governesses.
My sister and I had English nannies. Anna Coxhead, from Hampstead, smacked us, made us wash behind our ears, and took us to church. Cornelius Vanderbilt III.
Shortly after the governess was retired to the attic of the big house, the children, boys especially, but later girls, were sent to boarding school.
One of the oldest boarding schools is Groton in northeastern Massachusetts. The school first opened its doors in 1884. For generations, the Groton curriculum remained strikingly unchanged. Boys were registered at birth and entered at 12 or 13 years of age. At Groton, seen here in movies from the 50s, wealthy boys were sure to mix only with others of a similar station. But more importantly, they were toughened up to prepare them to take responsible roles in society.
I believe that there were servants waiting on them at table, but nonetheless, they had to take cold showers, and they had to indulge in very, very rough sports. There was no coddling, no cosseting of these children, and that was the point.
The Groton curriculum was based on the credo, "To whom much is given, much is expected." Along with traditional subjects, stern teachers tried to instill a social conscience and moral values in students such as Franklin D. Roosevelt. Groton and the other Eastern boarding schools were also conduits to elite colleges, such as Harvard and Yale. The club-like exclusivity of prep school and college was a prelude for adult life, where gentlemen's clubs and ladies' clubs kept the insiders in and the outsiders out. In New York City alone, there were well over 100 elite social clubs, and it was not unusual for a gentleman to have membership in 15 or more. For those reared in the upper-class curriculum, acceptable manners and etiquette were second nature. But the newly rich and uninitiated faced serious challenges. Take dining. In those days of 10-course dinners, there were specialized dining accessories that any well-born dinner guest would know how to use. For those from a more common background, sorting out a fish knife from an aspic paddle or a cream ladle from a marrow scoop would have been next to impossible. Another treacherous trap for the uninformed was the etiquette of visiting. The tool of visiting was the calling card. Depending on how it was used, a calling card could express many sentiments. For example, one turned up the upper left-hand corner of the calling card to offer congratulations, and the right-hand corner to offer condolences. Or was it the other way round? Only the socially adept knew for sure. In days gone by, disdain for publicity had been a hallmark of old money culture. The Knickerbockers used to say that a woman's name should appear in print only 3 times in her life: at her birth, marriage, and death.
Society people before the Civil War were very private about their social lives. They were for themselves, not for anyone else. They were not for public consumption.
But now, in the Gilded Age, the rich became the focus of national attention. And whether they loved them or hated them, the press and the public couldn't get enough.
Social people became celebrities. And they were the celebrities in this country until Hollywood arrived.
The most colorful grande dame of the era was Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, known to her friends simply as Mamie. With her flamboyant personality, Mamie was custom-made for the press. Before Mamie Fish, dinner parties were stuffy 3 to 4 hour eating and drinking marathons. Guests would pass out and be unceremoniously carted away from the table by their butlers.
They took 4 hours to have dinner. They never did anything else all day. They spent all day getting ready, getting dressed, and having the hairdresser, and getting all perfumed, and studying the guest list, and then the meal was on.
Mrs. Fish would have none of the long, drawn-out dinner parties. Hers typically lasted 50 minutes. Her parties were ironic send-ups of the rigid culture of the class to which she belonged. Few who attended ever forgot Mamie's famous monkey dinner, given for a chimpanzee dressed in full regalia and billed as the Prince del Drago. At another dinner, Mamie decided that everyone had to speak in baby talk. Perhaps her most controversial party was the dog's dinner, where owners served a multi-course feast of liver and rice and fricassee of bones to their pampered pets. When it got out that one of the dogs wore a $15,000 diamond collar, the public was outraged.
There's always a public outcry when people spend money. The balls people, of course, there were people who were dying of hunger and dying of tuberculosis in the streets of Manhattan. But they still love it. The have-nots love to look at what the haves are doing. They always have.
There was also a public outcry when James Hazen Hyde, heir to the Equitable Insurance fortune, made the mistake of inviting a squad of photographers to cover his elaborate costume ball. He had decided to indulge his interest in things French to create a Louis XV theme. So, with the help of an architect, he transformed Sherry's ballroom into a wing of Versailles. Priceless statuary and tapestries were brought from France by freighter. Guests in elaborate 18th century period costumes twirled and spun through rose petals that lay ankle-deep on the floor. The party cost $200,000, or in today's money, $2.7 million. When photos of the extravagant bash got into the newspapers, it provoked such an outcry that Hyde was driven into a 40-year exile in France.
People were fascinated by the details of the lives of these people because most people lived lives of quiet desperation. People saw these society figures as some fulfillment of a fantasy. And the thing about America is anyone, theoretically, can reach this fantasy.
Years earlier, the public's insatiable appetite for information about the elite had been whetted by a dazzling society wedding. In 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough was one of the most anticipated events New York had ever seen.
Ah, Consuelo Vanderbilt. I knew her in France as Madame Jacques Balzon. She was a beautiful, patrician, fascinating woman. She had a neck like a swan that went on forever. She used to wear jeweled dog collars of diamonds and pearls. That really showed off that neck to perfection.
Such a crowd of gawkers gathered outside the Fifth Avenue church that people were thrown under the wheels of the wedding carriage. But unknown to all but a few, Consuelo Vanderbilt had been forced into the marriage by her mother, the inimitable Alva Vanderbilt. The Duke of Marlborough had an aristocratic title and a vast estate, but was broke. Consuelo had plenty of money.
Her mother and father wanted to become the social king and queen of the world. So they got her married off to the Duke of Marlborough, who was a most unattractive man. He had a fabulous title, but he had moss green teeth, and his breath smelled bad. And she really didn't like him, and she tried hard to escape.
Consuelo was in love with another, less lordly young man.
My mother intercepted all letters my sweetheart wrote. She told me that if I succeeded in escaping, she would shoot my sweetheart, and she would therefore be imprisoned and hanged. Consuelo Vanderbilt.
Consuelo's money was clearly not bringing her happiness. She spent the morning of her wedding day alone and in tears.
No one came near me. A footman had been posted at the door of my apartment, and not even my governess was admitted. I felt cold and numb as I went down to meet my father and the bridesmaids who were waiting for me. We were 20 minutes late, for my eyes, swollen with the tears I had wept, required copious sponging before I could face the curious stares that always greet a bride. Consuelo Vanderbilt.
She had a few miserable years of being married to that man while he took a lot of her money. And later, when she got rid of him, she went to France and married a commoner, Jacques Balzan. She became a happy old lady. She died a happy old lady. I'm so glad.
As the century drew to a close, the mood universally lightened. It was the gay 90s, and everyone wanted to have fun. And for the rich, having fun in the Gilded Age would mean an orgy of dazzling, no-holds-barred, conspicuous consumption, the likes of which America had never seen before. The 1890s were called the Gay 90s, and for good reason. It was the heyday of vaudeville. Bicycling was the latest craze, and masses of people filled the beaches in summer, flaunting their latest bathing costumes. People wanted to have fun, and the rich were no different. The hundreds of new millionaires created by the Industrial Revolution weren't in the least bit hesitant to show just how well they could keep up with the Joneses, or the Astors for that matter. Before 1913, there was no income tax, so the rich had an almost unlimited amount of money.
If your income was $2 million a year or $20 million a year, you got $20 million. You didn't get half of it as you would today. You could have almost anything that you wanted.
With the tax-free money of the era, the rich had cash to spare. If you had it, the idea was to flaunt it. And flaunt it they did, in an orgy of conspicuous consumption that gave the era its name, the Gilded Age. And no family of the era matched the Vanderbilts in showing the world just what money could buy. In New York City, their palaces ranged up and down Fifth Avenue. Even more grandiose than the Vanderbilt mansions in New York was the house built by George Washington Vanderbilt, one of the Commodore's grandsons. On 125,000 acres of land outside Asheville, North Carolina, he built Biltmore House. Its 250 rooms sprawl over 175,000 square feet. Even today, no other private home in America approaches it in size. The Vanderbilt men were not the only ones with a passion for building on a grand scale. In Newport, Rhode Island, William Kissam's wife, Alva, and his brother Cornelius's wife, Alice, built second homes, what were popularly called summer cottages. Alva fired the first volley with Marble House. Awash in rare marbles, intricate carvings, and costly antiques, the house cost $11 million in 1892, or in today's dollars, $150 million. The following year, Alice used the same architect to begin construction on the Breakers, a 70-room palace fit for a queen. Countess Sapari, the granddaughter of Alice Vanderbilt, spent childhood summers at the Breakers and continues to live there today.
The extraordinary thing in the house is the workmanship. That cannot be repeated today. There are no people who can build a room like this. These two rooms, this room and the next room, the ballroom, were built in France, and they were transported here and put together here by workmen who were brought over from France. Look at every detail. It's incredible. Incredible.
Naturally, houses like the Breakers could not be run without servants, and in those days they came cheap, about $12 a month. According to a 1904 handbook for the wealthy, the average millionaire required a staff of about 40, including such necessities as a woman to pack and unpack luggage, 2 or 3 Irish girls for scrubbing and polishing, and a few servants for the servants. Great houses like the Breakers, with its 72 rooms and army of servants, were built for entertaining on a grand scale.
Here's a note that appeared in our volume. It is related of Mrs. Stokes that she recently received a telegram from a son in this year's class at Harvard, which read, "Coming tomorrow with a party of 97, to which the amiable lady made reply, 'Don't make it more than 50. Have friends here already.' June 30th, 1897.
In the Gilded Age, on the outside at the least, the rich were truly different. In a society where the average person worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, the rich devoted themselves to the fine art of leisure, and Newport was the epicenter of conspicuous leisure. At the turn of the century, much of New York society simply packed up and moved to Newport each summer, and it was a charmed life. Each morning, the children were driven to the beach by their nannies for a swim. The rest of the day was devoted to other pleasures.
There was a great deal of tennis, of riding, of driving. There were wonderful horses and beautiful carriages, all kept in the most wonderful way, all bright and shiny, the harness all bright and shiny.
After the days of childhood had passed, a pleasure yacht was the way a grown-up mega-millionaire might choose to express his wealth and taste. Dubbed with romantic names like Conqueror, Lysistrata, and Valhalla, the best yachts were floating odes to opulence. J.P. Morgan's yacht Corsair was 343 feet long and required a crew of 85. When questioned about the cost of its maintenance, Morgan snapped back with his celebrated aphorism, "If you have to ask what it costs, you can't afford it." Yachts weren't the only way to spend excess cash. At the turn of the century, automobiles were just beginning to appear on the scene, and the rich embraced them. These were not mass-produced Detroit models, but fully custom, foreign-built luxury machines. Alva Vanderbilt was the first to bring a car to America, while her son, William K. Vanderbilt, Jr., was taken enough with the new invention to build a 100-car garage next to his house. He also had a staff of 20 full-time chauffeurs and mechanics, and a 30-mile-long private driving track. Back in New York, Gilded Age palaces continued to spring up along Fifth Avenue. The leading architect of the day, Stanford White, designed many of them. White was in the center of New York society. Although married, he was a dashing millionaire man about town who made a habit of seducing young girls. In 1906, Stanford White became the victim of one of the juiciest murders of the century, and it all began with his passion for a beautiful showgirl.
Beauty is something that men will always go for, and the most beautiful women in the 19th century, the most photographed women in the 19th century, were women from the stage. They all had millionaires waiting outside their dressing rooms, many of them married millionaires. Great beauty is one of the keys that can let you into society.
Stanford White had fallen for Evelyn Nesbit, the most famous showgirl of her day. When she was a precocious 15 years old, White had taken her to his hideaway studio and seduced her on a red velvet swing. 3 years later, Evelyn Nesbit married Pittsburgh millionaire Harry Thaw.
If ever a murder had everything, Stanford White was in society in New York. He was also known as a philanderer. Evelyn Nesbit was considered the most beautiful woman who had appeared on the stage in decades. Harry Thaw was the heir to a great mining fortune. You had all the elements. You couldn't beat it.
On an early summer night in 1906, White was watching a performance of a light comedy on the rooftop of Madison Square Garden. The garden was his most recent design triumph. Evelyn Nesbit and Harry Thaw were also there. In mid-performance, White was approached by Thaw, who had been brooding over the rumors about White and his ex-showgirl wife. Thaw drew a gun, shot White 3 times point-blank in the face, killing him. The trial that followed was a sensation. White's reputation was ruined. Thaw was judged insane and spent most of the rest of his life in sanitariums.
I think the Stanford White murder was the subject of so much public interest because we always like to watch the high and mighty fall. And Stanford White was particularly high and particularly mighty. It fascinated people. Everyone loves the dark underside of glamour.
The rich in the Gilded Age were decadent, and they were susceptible to common human failings. But they also demonstrated a capacity for spending their money for the common good. The legacy of their excessive spending spree is now a vast public inheritance of architectural wonders. And the acquisitiveness of the wealthy has resulted in some of the world's finest museums and libraries. Several moguls housed their multi-million-dollar art collections in block-long mansions, which were converted to museums after their deaths. Philanthropy on a large scale also began in the Gilded Age. In an era before estate and inheritance taxes became a reason to donate money, Andrew Carnegie gave away nearly all his fortune, primarily to public libraries. He said that the man who died rich died disgraced.
He gave away during his lifetime maybe $300 million. In terms of purchasing power, of course, that's worth 10 times that, possibly more. He was one of the greatest philanthropists of all time.
One of the biggest tests of social responsibility for the rich was the First World War. Despite battle conditions more horrible than had ever been seen before, the sons of America's rich did not sit it out or seek rearguard duty as many had in the Civil War. Instead, young men on the honor rolls of America's elite schools volunteered, fought, and died to save Europe. All 4 of Theodore Roosevelt's sons served with distinction in the Great War. One of them, Quentin, did not return alive. Like all wars, the First World War brought great changes to American society. And whether they led the way or merely followed, the rich, like all Americans, were about to jump, drink, and dance their way into the modern world. The swell party of the Roaring Twenties was about to begin. With the end of the First World War, America was thrust into the modern world. No longer a frontier nation looking to Europe for inspiration, America had come of age. We flexed our muscles, sported new fashions, and found new ways to amuse ourselves. New families struck it rich, producing mass-marketed products like appliances, cereal, and of course, automobiles. New York society changed along with the rest of America, breaking out of the parlors and ballrooms of imperious social dictators like Mrs. Astor and Mamie Fish. The new in crowd was fractured and multifaceted and didn't live by the old rules. It was the jazz age, and this was cafe society. It was all about fresh faces, novel ideas, and above all, having fun in public. At legendary Manhattan nightclubs, even Prohibition couldn't stop the champagne from flowing. Outside the clubs, a sporting life took hold of the wealthy. Resorts devoted to upper-class leisure flourished in places like Palm Beach, Florida. And an institution, completely American, was already in place to accommodate the sports crazed, the country club. At exclusive clubs with names like Meadowbrook and Shinnecock Hills, the elite perfected their games of golf and tennis. Horses remained a favorite pastime of the well-to-do.
Since the time of the ancient Parthians, horses have been a symbol of wealth in almost all countries. It's extremely important in American society. It's still important in American society.
One of the premier venues for indulging the sport of kings had long been Saratoga Springs in upstate New York. William K. Vanderbilt had gone there on his honeymoon, using the gold-fitted family railroad car to transport his bride Alva in style. On the register of the honeymoon hotel, the bridegroom wrote, William K. Vanderbilt, wife, 2 maids, 2 dogs, and 15 horses. For many of the rich, just betting on horses wasn't enough. The proper blue blood had to ride them, too. For some, it took the form of the fox hunt, an old aristocratic sport which Oscar Wilde once defined as the unspeakable in full pursuit of the uneatable. For others, it was polo. Polo was an ancient sport the British brought back from India. In the 20s, for the first time, artists and celebrities, people who had made their mark through accomplishment, not birth into an old family, became part of society. In the past, writers and actors, people whose livelihoods were dependent on publicity, were shunned by the exclusive 400. But in cafe society, publicity was as coveted a commodity as money. In the glare of popping flash bulbs and swarms of society columnists, the rich and their famous friends turned the proper world of old New York money on its head. As a young man, George Plimpton witnessed firsthand the meeting of money and celebrity in the New York nightclubs.
I remember a friend of mine was a habitué of the Store Club. He was 23 or 24, and we were walking along the street once in the evening just outside the Store Club, and he said, let's go in. I said, I can't go in there. I'm wearing sneakers. And he said, it doesn't make any difference, watch. And we walked up to the door, and we were ushered into the Cub Room, which was the VIP room of the place. I looked across the room, and there was Howard Hughes with some movie star dancing, and he was wearing sneakers. So I felt much better about being in the place.
But despite all the ink spilled about the madcap goings-on in Manhattan, the New York rich were not the biggest celebrities anymore. In fact, all eyes had turned far to the west, to Hollywood. In the 20s, stars like Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, and Charlie Chaplin began to crowd the Eastern elite right off the society pages. The balance of wealth in America took on a decidedly westward tilt. Charlie Chaplin described the heady atmosphere.
I was light and unencumbered, 27 years old with fabulous prospects and a friendly, glamorous world before me. Within a short time, I would be a millionaire, and it all seemed slightly mad. Money was pouring into my coffers. Charlie Chaplin.
The rich were not immune to the lure and glamour of Tinseltown.
One of my favorite definitions of the word glamour is that when a glamorous person enters the room itself changes. People have it, and you know it in an instant. A lot of very glamorous people came from very poor circumstances. A lot of movie stars who invented themselves were glamorous people, and they came from nothing, or maybe from their own dreams.
Howard Hughes, the dashing young heir to a fortune made from oil drilling tools in Texas, felt the pull of Hollywood glamour. Hughes didn't care much for the family business. His interest lay more in breaking flying records, designing improbable airplanes like the Spruce Goose, and, of course, in dancing with starlets.
Oh, my God. There wasn't a movie star in Hollywood he didn't try to marry or own or keep for his own. Katharine Hepburn, Ginger Rogers, Lana Turner, all of them. I mean, there's hundreds of them. Hundreds, I mean, literally hundreds. And he'd have them spied on, and he'd lock them up and buy them houses and lock them up in it and not let them go out.
Although he was married in 1925 to wealthy Texas heiress Ella Rice, Hughes forced her to remain in Houston while he used his fortune to finance movies and pursue his romantic involvements in Hollywood. Rice's telegrams to her gallivanting husband were those of a miserable, lonely woman. "Please try and phone me. I don't intend to stay here very long. Miss you terribly." Or another, "I can't drift indefinitely. I find all this so embarrassing." When his wife finally filed for divorce in 1929, Hughes pursued his conquests unimpeded.
He was always promising women he would make them stars, and as he was a movie producer and had made some movies, some good movies, Hell's Angels, for instance, he was very effective to have all that money. It was sort of like being a king, you know, like it's good to be king. It was good to be Howard Hughes.
Howard Hughes wasn't the only mega millionaire who chased the holy grail of Hollywood. Publishing mogul William Randolph Hearst discovered Marion Davies when she was performing at the Ziegfeld Follies in New York. She was a 20-year-old dancer. He was 54 and married. Nevertheless, Hearst decided he was going to make Davies into a major Hollywood actress. Hearst hired the best writers and set designers to craft beautiful cinematic vehicles for Davies' rise to the top. Trouble was, most critics didn't think much of her acting ability. The kindest critics were those who wrote for Hearst's own newspapers. Their praise was inevitably along the lines of, "Marion never looked lovelier." Hearst's theatrical impulse was given full rein out of sight of the critics. High on a hilltop amid 240,000 acres overlooking California's central coast, Hearst challenged the Gilded Age palaces by building San Simeon, the greatest monument to lordly splendor ever seen in America. Hearst began building his pleasure palace in the 20s and never fully completed it. The cost? Over $15 million in furnishings alone. An insatiable collector of antiques, Hearst's purchases included an ancient Greek temple, which was dismantled and shipped piece by piece to San Simeon. Hearst and Davies hosted the Toast of Hollywood Society for long weekend parties at San Simeon. Davies later recalled,
"Before breakfast on Sunday, we'd play tennis or go horseback riding. The usual things, the sporting life routine. Nobody was allowed to ride where the wild animals roamed. There were lions and tigers, bears, leopards. W.R. thought it was picturesque. There was an elephant named after me. I was insulted." Marion Davies.
The swell party continued atop the remote mountain. But outside that magical kingdom, the fun had ended. For the rest of America, the Great Depression had begun. And even for the rich, it was time to pay the piper. swell party ended on October 28, 1929, better known as Black Tuesday. What had looked like growth and prosperity was actually a result of wild speculation in the stock market. Stock prices went into a free fall, and frantic investors dumped their shares for whatever they could get. Thousands of banks failed, and the hard-earned savings of the working and middle classes evaporated. Few escaped the ravages of the Great Depression. For the average family, it meant slashed wages, the loss of jobs, even begging in the street. For many, especially immigrant families, it was a drop back into poverty from whatever economic foothold they had managed to gain. But those at the very top of the economic ladder felt very little real financial pain. Yet during this time of national crisis, the rich faced a crisis of spirit. Spared the most dramatic experiences of their fellow countrymen, their wealth served to isolate them. Those who felt it most deeply were among the second and third generation heirs of the great fortunes. Inheritors of vast wealth discovered the numbing effects of lives spent without drive, without purpose, and worst of all, without risk. Long before the Depression, William K. Vanderbilt, a third-generation heir to one of the greatest fortunes, felt his inheritance as a dull, heavy weight.
My life was never destined to be quite happy. It has left me with nothing to hope for, with nothing definite to seek or strive for. Inherited wealth is a real handicap to happiness. William K. Vanderbilt.
This sense of boredom and disconnectedness was often compounded by families with an abundance of money and a dearth of love, attention, and stability. Children placed under the care of hired help or sent away to boarding schools often led miserable, lonely lives.
I've just decided that almost everybody's dysfunctional. I've decided every family is dysfunctional. There is no ideal situation for growing up. Rich people are miserable because they are spoiled or have too many privileges or somebody never said no to them, and poor people are not great either because they've had lives of deprivation and they're worried to death.
Whether money was the cause of their troubles or not, the 1930s was the era of the heiresses who would forever be known as poor little rich girls, for whom money clearly could not buy happiness. Perhaps the most famous was little Gloria Vanderbilt, her childhood scarred by a fierce custody battle. But there were others. Barbara Hutton, one of the richest young women of the time, didn't have a great childhood either. And the search for happiness is the recurring theme that runs through her life. The granddaughter of 5 and 10 magnate F.W. Woolworth, Barbara's own parents were barely part of her life. She saw her mother die when she was 4. Her mother's death left an unfillable void. "I barely remember her," Barbara once said, "but I've missed her all my life." After her mother's death, her father, financier Franklin Hutton, was a very eligible bachelor. He remarried, but Barbara refused to live with him. For most of what remained of her childhood, she was shuttled between boarding schools and relatives. During the height of the Depression, Barbara Hutton inherited $50 million, bringing her total worth to $80 million. At her lavish debutante ball, the band was instructed to, under no circumstances, play the current hit song about Barbara, "I Found a $1 Million Baby at the 5 and 10 cent store." In 1933, at the age of 21, Barbara married for the first time, the first of 7 marriages.
I think it's very tough to be very rich because you never know whether somebody really, really loves you.
Barbara had a knack for attracting the wrong men, especially foreign ones with titles. Her first marriage was to a man claiming to be a prince from Russian Georgia. Hutton's second marriage to a Danish count was doomed to failure from the start. And to add to her trouble, she continued to be the subject of a great deal of publicity, much of it negative. Her image as a freewheeling heiress didn't sit well with an American public in the depths of a depression. In 1939, on one of her periodic returns to America, picketers showed up outside her Pierre Hotel suite bearing signs such as, "We live on $16.50 a week, could you?" A man in the crowd shouted, "You rich bitch, I'd like to throw acid in your face." Barbara couldn't understand it. "Why do they hate me?" she asked. "There are other girls as rich, richer, almost as rich. Why do they especially dislike me?" Hutton's third marriage to actor Cary Grant was short-lived. Barbara's fifth husband was the smooth-talking Latin playboy Porfirio Rubirosa, once the son-in-law of the Dominican dictator. With his good looks and suave manners, Ruby, as he was called, was a hit among society women. The omens for the success of this marriage were worse than usual. Throughout the macabre wedding ceremony, Barbara alternated between drinking champagne and crying. After signing the contract, Barbara turned to Ruby and asked, "Aren't you going to kiss me now? The press has waited so long." The marriage lasted 72 days. Hutton ran through 2 more husbands, and finally her money too. At her death, of a fortune that had once totaled $80 million, there was a mere $3,500 remaining in her account.
These debutantes, this kind of press interest, it was all they knew. They never had a chance to sort of go out with normal men who would have made them happy, who would have adored them for themselves instead of for their money.
Not all rich heiresses ended up like Hutton, but most of them started out the same way, as debutantes, a ritual peculiar to the upper class. Seen here in movies from the 1960s, the debutante rite of passage remained largely unchanged since the 1930s. When a girl turned 18, it was expected that she would formally come out to take her place in society, capital S. Her coming out year usually included a series of teas and luncheons with other established members of society. It all culminated in the coming out party. Despite hard times for the rest of America, or maybe because of them, the 30s were the golden age of the debutantes. The press turned the debutante balls into huge media events. Each debutante season, one girl was mysteriously anointed the #1 Deb.
Well, to be #1 debutante of the year was, when I was growing up, was really hot stuff. It was glamour. You had to be beautiful. You had to be very, very rich. And you got a coming out party worthy of the Queen of England. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of flowers, and a changing of bands, 3 bands, and dancing all night. This was glamour. And Mrs. Housewife, reading about it in her morning paper, thought it was great.
The biggest debutante of them all had to be Brenda Diana Duff Fraser. With a ghostly white face, jet black hair, and bright red lips and nails, she personified the era's ideal of beauty. Only Garbo was said to be more glamorous. Every nuance of Fraser's 1938 coming out party was covered relentlessly by the tabloid press. And for the rest of her debut year, she was at the beck and call of press agents nationwide. She didn't relish it.
I'm not a celebrity. I don't deserve all this. I haven't done anything at all. I'm just a debutante. Brenda Fraser.
Brenda's subsequent life followed the pattern of Barbara Hutton's and other young women who started out with too much money and too much press attention. She married football hero John Shipwreck Kelly in 1941, but within 10 years was going out with 4 men at once, including her husband. This led to some famous public brawls on the part of her suitors and an increasing dependence on pills for Brenda. After a nervous breakdown and a divorce from Kelly, Fraser declared,
"Being the #1 glamour deb is the worst thing that can happen to you. It's all so superficial. It means nothing. I wouldn't let it happen to my child at all."
Soll vor sich hertragen und wir werden in unserem Zeichen wieder siegen.
Soon the public's attention would shift from debutante balls to a more urgent cause. Although America tried to stay out of Hitler's war, the bombing of Pearl Harbor plunged the U.S. into World War II. America's entry into the war caused a great surge of patriotism among Americans of every stripe. Just as in the First World War, young heirs from the best families jumped into the fray. The gravity of the situation pulled them out of their malaise and gave them the chance to prove themselves. Vincent Astor put his giant yacht at the disposal of the U.S. Navy and then went to Europe to join in the fight. Other well-known families whose sons saw battle were the Roosevelts and the Kennedys. And each of these families suffered losses. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. died in the invasion of Normandy. And Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., the eldest of Joe Kennedy's sons, was killed in wartime service over England. At war's end, soldiers, both rich and poor, would share a sense of solidarity from their common experience that, for once, would make class differences irrelevant. One of the veterans was handsome John Fitzgerald Kennedy. His meteoric rise to the presidency would show that in a time of shared prosperity, at least, Americans were not averse to having men of privilege running the country. It wouldn't hurt either that his bride-to-be, Jacqueline Bouvier, was a woman of uncommon charm and beauty, the #1 debutante of her year. The veterans of the Second World War came home to an America stronger than ever. The war had done the trick and the economy was booming. Many Americans shared in the good economic times. The gap between rich and poor narrowed. Soldiers got good educations on the GI Bill and emerged as a generation of professionals. The middle class came into its own, upwardly mobile and able to afford the houses and vacations that had previously been the sole domain of the rich. Unlike the aftermath of the First World War, this time it was a solid and conservative prosperity. Young people in the late 40s and early 50s wanted to start a family, not an all-night party. No young family embodied the hopes and dreams of America better than that of the young senator on the rise, John F. Kennedy. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was a Navy veteran who served on a PT boat, a war hero who had guided his men to safety after their vessel was rammed and cut in half by a Japanese destroyer. His rapid ascent to the presidency was the culmination of the carefully laid plans of ambitious forefathers. His grandfather was the colorful two-time Boston Mayor John "Honey" Fitzgerald. JFK's father, Joseph Kennedy, made a fortune in bootlegging during Prohibition and later became a respected figure in Boston and Washington society after making more money through investments in stocks, importing, shipbuilding, and movie making. His ascent was tied to the practice first championed in American society by the Astors, marrying well. Typically, each generation of Kennedys chose wives of higher birth to boost their leap upward. For John Kennedy, it was Jacqueline Bouvier. From the time Jackie was a little girl, she was being written about in the social columns. She had unquestionable beauty, but she also had talent, boxloads of blue ribbons from equestrian competitions. And brains. She won the grand prize over 1,200 other college women in a Vogue magazine academic competition. Her coming out was a noted event.
America's a country of traditions. Every 4 years we elect a president. Every year a Queen of Debutantes is crowned. Queen Deb of the Year is Jacqueline Bouvier, a regal brunette who has classic features and the daintiness of Dresden porcelain. She has poise, is soft-spoken and intelligent, everything the leading debutante should be. Igor Cassini.
Despite her obvious attributes, Jacqueline was often lonely and worried that she would never be wed. But her fairy tale marriage to John F. Kennedy in 1953 was the first step leading to the mythological Camelot presidency.
I don't like Camelot. I don't think that's the proper word. Fairy tale, it wasn't a fairy tale. It was young, vital, vibrant America on the march. To see those young Kennedys in the White House, those young, beautiful, stylish Kennedys, with those gorgeous children, everything was right.
There was no question about JFK's popularity, but for many observers, the dazzling young First Lady was the Kennedy that really mattered.
She was the Princess Diana of her era, but so much smarter and so much more meaningful and so much more powerful. She did influence the president. She knew everything that was going on. She briefed herself before going on a foreign visit for weeks ahead of time. She could make a conversation with a professor of history from the local university of that country.
Estas cosas deberían estar al alcance de todos y no limitarse a unos pocos afortunados.
JFK and Jackie were icons for a new generation of wealth. Sophisticated, jet-setting, media-savvy, and telegenic. During a period of post-war prosperity, their wealth and style were celebrated by an adoring public, no longer disgusted by opulence as it had been during the Depression.
I think that his presidency, if you like, was the last nationwide public dramatization of the mythology of upper-classness. The drama of Jack and Jackie, the drama of his heroism in the war, the drama of her good taste and his courage.
For once, Americans had a royal family. But it ended too soon. We mourned John F. Kennedy's passing as the death of a king. But even before the walls of Camelot came crashing down, JFK and Jackie had shared the throne with another couple with real royal titles, Prince Rainier and Grace Kelly. Although Grace came from a prominent family in Philadelphia, she opted out of the debutante balls and society teas and headed for Hollywood. There, her classic blonde beauty quickly landed her parts in films. It was on a break from filming To Catch a Thief that she first met her prince-to-be. The following year, they met again at a dinner and were engaged within 3 days. Before anything could happen, terms had to be negotiated. The royal family required that Grace be a virgin, an issue that she was able to skirt. They also required that her father pay a dowry, which he did, and because of concerns about royal succession, Rainier would keep the children in the event of a divorce, no exceptions. Jack Kelly had his own demands. First, he asked for an accounting of Rainier's financial situation. When the prince's agent reached $1 million, Kelly stopped him. "I have one final question," he said. "I've heard that this fellow has a mistress. There'll be none of that, or Grace will leave him." 4 months later, after a mammoth shipside news conference, Grace, her family, and 50 friends set sail for Monaco aboard the SS Constitution. It was 8 days of speeches, parties, champagne, and games. One of Grace's friends called it a floating summer camp. The wedding and the dozens of receptions preceding it mesmerized the world. No fewer than 1,600 reporters covered the festivities, more than had covered D-Day in Normandy. All 3,000 adult citizens of Monaco attended the wedding.
She went over as a movie star, and let's face it, Hollywood is not very classy. She went from that environment to the fairyland of Monaco, a tiny little kingdom that belongs in a book. She did become Her Serene Highness. She rose to the occasion, just as Jacqueline Kennedy did.
There are many opinions about whether the lives of Jackie Kennedy and Grace Kelly really turned out to be fairy tales. Some mothers will always be unwilling to leave it to fate for Prince Charming to find their daughters. In the annals of husband hunting, few have been equal to Mrs. Harvey Cushing. Her 3 daughters, Babe, Betsy, and Minnie, were all charming, attractive, and intelligent, just right for attracting society's most eligible bachelors, if only they could be introduced into the proper circles. The way it turned out, Minnie married Vincent Astor. Betsy first married FDR's son, James Roosevelt, and later Whitney heir, Jock Whitney, nailing down 3 of the most dominant families in the country. The youngest sister, Babe, with her long, swan-like neck and dark, flashing eyes, turned the head of William Paley, head of the CBS network. Instantly smitten, Paley divorced his wife so he could be free to marry Babe. There was one problem. Paley was Jewish. East Coast society had always been the exclusive sphere of white Protestants. Jews, or blacks, or anyone else for that matter, were not welcome. The fact that Paley was Jewish and knew money probably did not make Babe's mother very happy, but his millions smoothed over those objections.
He was this, I guess, son of a Jewish cigar manufacturer who became the head of, kind of invented modern broadcasting, became the head of CBS. And his ultimate prize in life was to marry this beautiful wasp and enter society himself. It was one of the great breakthroughs. Mrs. Paley was just impossibly beautiful.
After they were married, William and Babe Paley moved in the circles of New York high society. Babe was a symbol of the jet set, the beautiful people, the in crowd. But unlike the past, there was really no center to the social scene in the Big Apple of the 1960s. Society, with a capital S, was getting harder and harder to define. It was no longer just individuals born into old families, but included people who had accomplished something.
I think it was Charlie Knickerbocker who began writing and talking about the society of merit rather than a society of social pretension. So that was a step. For example, I suppose it really its height was Truman Capote's black and white ball.
In 1966, writer Truman Capote gave a legendary party that has come to define the ascendance of the Society of Merit, the Black and White Ball. George Plimpton was one of the partygoers.
It was this extraordinary mixture of, and true, there were some members of high society there, the Paleys, for example. Barbara Paley was one of the more powerful social figures in New York City.
But there are also guests at the Black and White Ball like economist Kenneth Galbraith, historian Arthur Schlesinger, and writer Norman Mailer.
Extraordinary, disparate group of people, all of whom were there not necessarily because they were Truman's close friends, but because they succeeded in their fields.
The Black and White Balls showed just how far society had come for Mrs. Astor and the insular list of the 400. The eclectic guest list also revealed just how many factions society had splintered into, making the very word seem like a relic of another era. In fact, it was another era. The world was changing fast, and traditional values were up for questioning. As the 60s came to an end, debutante balls, social A-lists, and lavish parties were the last things on the minds of the young, rich and poor alike. Less than 2 years after the glamorous Black and White Ball, the war in Vietnam escalated disastrously. Both Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy fell to assassins' bullets, heightening the disillusionment of the nation's youth. Everywhere, kids were repeating the mantra, "Don't trust anyone over 30, especially your parents." This idea had a particular sting for kids whose parents were Mr. and Mrs. Rockefeller. As the counterculture came into full bloom, it spread through upper-class families like wildfire. Wealthy heirs had a difficult time reconciling their family money and privilege with other people's poverty and oppression. Many wealthy kids threw themselves into the great causes of the day. And tycoons who expected their sons and daughters to understand and adopt the traditional roles of great wealth were surprised by the radical ideas coming from their own children. When the Vietnam War finally ended, baby boomers across America felt they had just begun to change the world. But the spirit of activism didn't last. While in the 70s, young heirs had gone to great lengths to look like everyone else, all of a sudden in the 80s, it was in to be visibly rich. Ronald Reagan's ascent into the White House in 1980 ushered in a new era of prosperity. And a lot of people were rich and getting richer. The 80s were about getting, spending, and flaunting.
There was a sense of swing that you just don't have, probably even today, that was very evident in the 1980s. A period of optimism that I'm not sure that you'll ever have again.
Carnegie's dictum, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced," was subverted to the popular 80s slogan, "He who dies with the most toys wins." In a single-minded drive to make money, some people went too far. Financier Michael Milken was making up to $700 million a year financing corporate takeovers, some say destroying good companies, with junk bonds. His predatory methods landed him in prison. Also sent to jail was hotel queen Leona Helmsley for tax evasion. "We don't pay taxes," she says. "The little people pay taxes." By the end of the 80s, there was a sense of overindulgence.
Things that happened in the 1980s you probably don't do today, especially the spending of money so freely. I think you tend to be a little bit more conservative. You've gone through the 80s, and then God or somebody came down and said, "That's not good."
Today, many wealthy Americans are once again evaluating their place in society and the responsibilities of wealth.
They have to, at some point, look at this accumulation and say, what does it all mean? What am I going to do with it? How many suits do I need? How many cars must I have? How many houses? There comes a time when they have to look at themselves and say, all right, now is my moment to start giving back.
Giving back has been a constant theme in the life of Tony Duke, one of the heirs to the Duke tobacco fortune.
It's one of man's best instincts to feel that you want to share the good things in life with your friends and with other people. And I've always felt that we're very fortunate to live in a democracy, but I don't think our democracy can survive if too many people fall through the cracks and don't ever enjoy its fruits.
The drama of wealth as a test of individual character runs like a refrain through Tony Duke's family. In stark contrast are Tony and his first cousin Doris Duke. One found meaning and purpose in inherited wealth, and the other was crushed by it. Doris Duke was the primary heir to the great Duke tobacco fortune. Like Barbara Hutton and Brenda Fraser, she was one of the poor little rich girls. Doris Duke had many unhappy marriages and never really found a use for her talents and her money. She died at age 80 in Beverly Hills in 1993, a sizable chunk of her tangled estate left to her butler. Shaken by the injustice of the poverty he saw around him as a young man during the Depression, Tony Duke early on felt a sense of social responsibility.
Anybody who inherited a lot of money, I'd want them certainly to have a good time. You can't blame them for wanting to do that, but I think that hopefully they'd have the common sense to know that they do have a responsibility towards their fellow man.
Wanting to share the privileges he had enjoyed, Tony Duke founded Boys Harbor in 1937, first a camp and now a school for kids from Harlem. For decades, he has run the organization hands-on, day in and day out. Giving back is not a new idea. Carnegie gave away almost his entire fortune at a time when there was no tax incentive to do so. Vincent Astor, the last of his line, gave his wife Brooke Astor the responsibility of giving away the last of the Astor fortune, a charge he has admirably executed in good works all over New York City, the place where old John Jacob Astor first made his money. For generations, the Rockefeller family has placed more emphasis on giving than on spending. The tradition started with John D. Sr., who endowed the University of Chicago and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. At his death, he gave $500 million to establish a foundation. Today, the various Rockefeller family foundations support countless worthy institutions and causes. And finally, another of the old families, the Vanderbilts, are still intact with a strong sense of family history.
I'm very proud of my family. I find these books that people write that never knew any, not one of them, that give them very little credit for what they did and what they achieved in their own life. There isn't one of them that wasn't an achiever, not one.
Today, little remains of the fortune that once made the Vanderbilts one of the most famous families in America. There are over 150 billionaires in the United States today, and with $18 billion, Bill Gates is at the top of the list. New fortunes are being made every day. Sports stars, entertainers, and high-tech moguls are the new Rockefellers and Vanderbilts.
Whether they are doing good or doing ill. And as long as we have those people who are always dreaming big dreams and achieving those dreams, there will be hope in this country of getting somewhere, being somebody, doing something, leaving a lasting impression.
What would the history of this country look like without the rich? If there were no great fortunes, would there be less poverty? If there were no great entrepreneurs, would we have world-class museums and cultural and educational institutions which are the pride of the nation? And in more personal terms, aside from their money, are the rich different from you and me? One thing is clear. The story of wealth in America is as complex as the makers and inheritors of wealth, as complex as the lives of all human beings.